So this is Unit 3. So today we're going to talk about 4 academic vocabularies. They are alert, gauge, compelling, and rigid. So let's start with the first vocabulary. So the first vocabulary is alert. You can follow me when I read it. This is pronounced as alert. Alert. You can also follow the IPA form here and read it out. Okay, so let's continue to the definition of alert. Alert is a verb. It means state without proof. So by saying you alert someone, you mean you're stating him without proof. The morphological derivation of alert is allegation. Allegation. Allegation is a noun. It means a claim that someone has done something wrong, but typically without proof. By saying you made an allegation, it means you made a claim that someone has done something wrong, but usually don't have any proof. Another morphological derivation of alleged is alleged. Alleged is an adjective. It's also the past tense and perfect tense of alleged. It means claimed without proof. By saying someone is alleged, it means he is claimed without proof. So let me give you some sentence examples of alleged. The first example is, it was alleged that this dialect came from the Outcomers language. It was alleged that this dialect came from the Outcomers language. The second example is, he claimed that he was alleged to be the suspect and actually not guilty. He claimed that he was alleged to be the suspect and actually not guilty. In both sentences, the verb allege means state something without proof. It means state something without proof. In the first sentence, this dialect came from the Outcomers language. This thing, it is stated, but it doesn't have any proof to prove it. In the second sentence, he claimed that he was alleged to be the suspect. So it means he was said to be the suspect, but there's no proof to prove that he is the suspect. So in your academic assignments, when you want to say something is stated or something is claimed, but it is actually a hypothesis or a guess, you can actually say something is alleged. So here is 2 common collocations of the verb allege. First is verb plus to be. So alleged to be. He was alleged to be the murderer. He was alleged to be the murderer. It's actually he was claimed to be the murderer, but there's no proof to prove that he committed the murder. The second collocation is verb plus to and plus verb. So alleged, for example, alleged to have, alleged to have. He is alleged to have mistreated the prisoner. He is alleged to have mistreated the prisoners. It's also similar with the first collocation. He is actually claimed to have mistreated the prisoners, but there's no proof to prove that. Okay, let's move on to the second word. The second word is gauge. Gauge. You can follow me when I read it. Gauge. You can also read from the IPA form here. It's read as gauge. The definition of gauge is to measure the dimension of something. Gauge is a verb. So you can see in the picture here, you're gauging something. It means you're measuring the dimension of it. Okay, these are the morphological derivations of the word gauge. The continuous tense of gauge is gauging, and the past tense and perfect tense of gauge is gauged. But also, the adjective gauging is also an active form of gauge, and the adjective gauge is a passive form of gauge. So let me give you some sentence examples. The first example is, scientists try to gauge the weight of oxygen. Scientists try to gauge the weight of oxygen. The second example is, the impact of gender on English reading comprehension is hard to gauge. The impact of gender on English reading comprehension is hard to gauge. So in both sentences, gauge means to measure the dimension of something. So the first sentence is science actually is the scientists are actually trying to measure the weight of oxygen. In the second example is the impact of gender on reading comprehension is hard to measure or hard to evaluate. So when you want to say evaluate or measure in your assignments, by being more academic, you can use the word gauge instead. Okay, here are two common collocations of the word gauge. One is adjective plus to gauge. So you can say hard to gauge, easy to gauge, impossible to gauge. For example, it is hard to gauge accurately how much water is needed. It is hard to gauge accurately how much water is needed. Another common collocations of gauge is verb plus to gauge. Verb plus to gauge. For example, try to gauge, need to gauge. The second example is researchers need to gauge the impact of first language on people's way of thinking. Researchers need to gauge the impact of first language on people's way of thinking. So in both sentences, in both collocations, gauge is actually replacing the word measure. So you can say hard to measure, you can also say hard to gauge. You can say try to measure, you can also say try to gauge. Okay, let's move to the next word. It is compelling. Compelling. You can also read from the IPA form here, compelling. There are two definitions of the adjective compelling. One is demanding attention. Demanding attention. So by saying something is compelling, you can say this is demanding attention. This is a highlight, or it needs attention. The second meaning of compelling is convincing, persuasive. So by saying something is compelling, you can either mean it is demanding attention. You can also mean this is very convincing, depend on the meaning of the sentence. The word compelling is actually derived from the verb compel. Compel means to force somebody to do something. So by saying you compel something, you mean so by saying you compel somebody, it means you are forcing him to do something. Another derivation of compelling is uncompelling. It's the opposite meaning of compelling. So by saying something is uncompelling, it means this is not persuasive. So let me give you two sentence examples for the two meanings. One is, this was such a compelling topic that many linguists studied on it. It was such a compelling topic that many linguists studied on it. So it means this was a very good topic that is catching attention by many linguists, so they study on it. So when you are trying to say something is very attractive, something is very arousing interest, you can say something is very compelling to be more academic. The second sentence example is, to make a prosecution, the judge needs compelling evidence. To make an prosecution, the judge needs compelling evidence. So when you are saying something is very persuasive in your assignment, you can use something is very compelling instead. So the collocation of compelling is usually compelling plus noun. Compelling plus noun. So you can say it's a compelling fact. It's a compelling evidence, compelling reason, or compelling argument. So there are two sentence examples given here. One is, this is a compelling argument that the sample might be polluted by other dependent factors. Second sentence example is, Theories require compelling facts to support them. Theories require compelling facts to support them. Both sentences can be used in academic assignments because they are actually leading to the following research or following arguments. Okay, the last word is rigid. Rigid. You can follow me when I read it, and you can also read out from the IPA form here. So it's read as rigid. There are two definitions of the adjective rigid. First is not permitting any change. Not permitting any change. The second is not able to be bent. Not able to be bent. So you need to identify different meanings of rigid in an article according to the article's meaning. According to the sentences around. So the morphological derivation of rigid is rigidity. 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 The word rigidity is a noun. It means the degree of being rigid. It means the degree of being rigid. So by saying you are evaluating its rigidity, you are actually evaluating the degree of this thing being very rigid. And the second derivation is rigidize. Rigidize. The verb rigidize means to make or become rigid. So by saying something is rigidized, it means it was made rigid. It was made rigid. So there are two sentence examples of the adjective rigid. The first is the absence of agreed standards makes the enforcement of rigid rules difficult. The absence of agreed standards makes the enforcement of rigid rules difficult. So actually, those rules are not able to be changed. So the absence of the standards make the enforcement of those rules difficult. The second example is this equipment used rigid metal so that it won't be easily destroyed. This equipment used rigid metal so that it won't be easily destroyed. So here, the rigid actually means not easy to be bent. The metal is not easy to be bent so that it's not easily destroyed. So at last, let me give you a common collocation of the word rigid. It's usually verb plus adjective. So you can say grow to be rigid. You can say grow rigid, or appear to be rigid, or become rigid. This material appears to be even more rigid after heated. So this material is actually becoming more difficult to be bent after heated. The second example is people tend to be more rigid as they grow older. People tend to be more rigid as they grow older. So actually, people are becoming more difficult to change their minds as they grow older. People tend to be more rigid as they grow older. So this is the end of Unit 3. Thank you for your watching.